Third posture, deep breath.
Hello, everyone. Let us all notice our posture and take a deep breath. All right, so let's jump in. Hopefully, you've been watching the videos. Thanks for coming, live or otherwise. Surround sound. But let's pull up the questions and we'll dive right in. Let's see, where are they? Select a tab. There you are. Okay, share, view. Perfect. All right. Can you see it, Cherie?
I can.
Great. All right. So scroll down. We marked where we left off. And I'm going to do a little treat because Cherie has been encouraging me to do this, and Cherie is always right. So we left off here, witnessing, identifying parts. So let's rewind. We're going to go up to the mini table, call it the mini table, mini me, and just walk through how we got here as a very short review and just to help us orient. So we covered the questions that involve naming issue and identifying the parts. We talked about unblending and nurturing a self-to-part relationship, which is what unblending creates by default. And then we've talked about contracting. I've gone over the main concerns that managers have, the main concerns that exiles have, and some other pieces around contracting, honoring parts. The 5Fs, we did a 6F extravaganza, and now we're ready to talk more about witnessing. Now, before we dive in, Cherie and I were talking about if you read the IFS workbook, they don't say a lot about working with exiles, and they strongly recommend doing level 1 training, I think, as a minimum before you ever work with exiles. That confuses me a bit, mainly because IFS is not the only model that works with intense feelings, intense somatic states. We can call them defense completions. Everything I went over the last video about emotions. I think emotions are one of the most natural and deepest aspects of our experience. I see them through a transpersonal lens. So feelings are the language of the soul. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I honestly, I cringe at anything out there that would cause a therapist to have manager parts relating to exiles. And exiles in conscious heart integration, which is the model I've developed since learning IFS, exiles tend to come from the emotional body. And so think about, I've mentioned this, think about a young kid, they're completely losing their poop. Really, the last thing you want to do is approach them as, ooh, I shouldn't mess with you until I do, level 1 IFS training, or anything like that. It's just emotions. Of course, I get it. We don't want to, re-traumatize clients. My take on that is it's re-traumatizing for clients, for therapists to act in traumatizing ways. If there's something that spontaneously arises in the session, and that's going to happen, it's our job to relate to it from self. And I think as long as we can do that, I've talked about it a bunch, simply maintaining contact, people can work through pretty much anything. That's our responsibility. It is not to signal you're too much, this is too much, hold my kombucha while I do some more training around how to deal with intense emotions. Whatever you need to do to learn that or develop that, that's your countertransference, and it's time to get to work. If that's the case, here's the irony, is that if you do this really well, which is why the 6Fs have gotten a lot more attention in my experience more recently, you do this really well, that is one of the best regulating trauma-informed ways to approach whatever's in the id, whatever's in the unconscious, whatever's been exiled, whatever the traumatized memory is or was. Um, and guess what? Okay, I'm totally going on a diatribe, but I feel really strongly about this. Here's another catch in all this. When people enter environments that are more loving, that acts as like a tractor beam to invite and allow anything that hasn't been loved to come to the surface. I want you to think about intense emotions in that way. And so, holy setup, if we do our best to set up the safe space and then people start getting more vulnerable and we can't handle just being with their feelings, that should be like a basic minimum. Um, so, exiles happen. I don't care what your approach is. You've been working probably with exiles. I hope so. I mean, I guess unless you're like, I would argue old school CBT, like CBT has evolved from CBT to DBT to ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. That's all considered under the behavior modification CBT universe. Um, and ACT is now one of the most beautiful models around accepting whatever's in there. And I think I've pitched it once, I'll pitch it again. Act in action. I mean, I love IFS. I absolutely start with IFS. I think it's a great, great place to start, but don't park it there. There's a lot of important models we need to learn. Just let me do a sidebar about that really quickly. So in conscious heart integration, I essentially talk about, I've mentioned the emotional body. There's also obviously the physical body, and those are a little bit different, obviously. And if you weave in NVC, you can over time start to identify the consistent needs that each of these have. I'm not going to get into that right now, but think and explore, and you'll discover the same thing. But that's really powerful, a pattern to understand. And so then on top of that, if you look at Freud's model, so he has id, the way he breaks up consciousness, it overlaps a bit with IFS. The way Dick structures consciousness, in a sense, is we have exiles, firefighters, managers. If you look at Freud's topology, is what I think some people call it, the bottom two firefighters and exiles, if you read Freud, that's what he's describing. He's describing firefighters and exiles. And if you look at, you look at managers and then take Freud's typology and put them next to each other, Freud really interestingly has ego and superego. And I think some people would say, oh, managers and self. You could say that, but I've collected a lot of different models. I have a pretty big table that essentially breaks up the psyche into four. And I think that's more accurate to say that there's mental body and there's an intellectual body, which is a little bit different than a mental body. Mental body would be more thoughts, just kind of immediate thinking. And then the intellectual body, you have to it's almost pre-conscious, which is how Freud talked about the superego. And it's more the aspect of ourselves that's like a scientist, can be curious, but makes the broader stories, the beliefs. So if you look at Dan Siegel, I think he calls it SIRT, sensations, SIFT maybe, sensations, physical body, feelings, emotional body, thoughts would be mental body, and then images, which are much more complex than thoughts, that would be intellectual body. Some people have a hard time really understanding the distinction between mental and intellectual. So don't worry about that right now at this point. If you're new to me and new to my work, we'll get to some other stuff that will flesh it out. But my point being, if you're like a hardcore CBT person, old school CBT, the way I learned it, they would only work in the channel of the mental body and intellectual body. Narrative therapy would be more intellectual body. CBT, thinking errors, thought distortions, cognitive distortions, that's very mental body. And obviously it overlaps with intellectual body. And here's the irony. I once worked with Merv Davies. I don't know if I've mentioned him yet, but he was like the program director, I think. or the clinical director at Alternative Homes for Youth when I worked there, and he was an absolute, I'm sure he still is, master at CBT. And when I watched him work with these teenage boys, and essentially the interventions in this treatment center, which was for, they called it sexually abusive youth. At the time, I'm sure that term has changed to be more politically correct, so I apologize. But he would, the main interventions were sex education and working with thinking errors. That's the bulk of what he did. And he was such an experienced master therapist, I would argue. Watching him work was like watching someone like Dick work. He came from so much self energy and was so compassionate about the ways that he talked to these kids. He was he was absolutely amazing, and he essentially was doing IFS without doing IFS. He was probably more doing ACT. So all that to say, what's amazing about ACT and where CBT has evolved to is, yeah, they want to get to the behavior mod piece. You're going to take action, but not until you can actually accept what is going on inside your body. And if you end up watching ACT in action, I'll put a link to that in the description. It's like sloppy IFS, and it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant in its own way. And he's a great model for somebody who just can hold space, not get triggered, stay in self as people tap into some really powerful emotions and old experiences. I'll just give you another example. Like, these are some people that I just want to throw out there as maybe models and teachers, and CBT, arguably CBT. And ironically, arguably, I would say the most effective form of CBT I've ever come across, if you're just doing straight up CBT and nothing else. Some of you probably are already guessing. I'm talking about Byron Katie, and she has a model called The Work. Is it true? Can you absolutely know it's true? Trick question. The answer is always no. That creates a little bit of more mental opening, unblending for manager parts. And then the next question is, how do you react when you do think it's true? What's the price you pay is kind of what she's asking. Guess what? She just dropped into, potentially, depending on what people share, into a somatic experience, which is its own form of meditation. And then who would you be without that story? Now, boom, intellectual body. That is an absolutely brilliant way to clear out just the thinking stuff. And I would argue that's the best version of CBT I've ever come across. And I have watched videos. She's not even a therapist. And I'm not saying people who aren't therapists shouldn't do therapy. And go watch this woman because she knows what she's doing. She has people look at some really, really, really intense stuff and be with really, really intense stuff as she essentially just does CBT with them. So I don't know. This I don't think is around as much anymore. But when I was going through school, they were just interesting. I mean, maybe it's still around, but almost like a turf war between the CBT folks and the somatic folks. It's silly. You have to learn how to work with each of these bodies. All that said, a lot of what we're doing in the first three phases is more mental body, intellectual body work, and then we're creating the right space to tap into the physical and emotional body, what Freud maybe would call the id. All right, so all that said, we've gone through these first three. Now we're about to go into witnessing. And so what I want to name is, and what I will acknowledge is, working with exiles is different. Officially, like, yes, that's therapy. That's not coaching. Coaching is more future-based. Therapy is more in the past. So everything I'm about to say, here's the disclaimer. This is for therapists, people learning to become and are psychotherapists. We're getting into therapy work. A lot of these first three steps, you could say, is kind of coachy in a way, but can slip into therapy as soon as you're getting into witnessing any material that's historical, somatic, feeling-based, and whatnot. There's so much more I can say. I'll just name it because I can hopefully get to it sooner rather than later. I have a whole series of videos that I used for the Gestalt class that talk about all the different types of resourcing. Not all, but I cover a lot. That would be a great resource. Learn about the different kinds of resourcing. I'll give you just a snapshot of some of the most, yeah, this is important. We're just going to take the time for it. So let's call it front load resourcing. These are the folks who want to make sure that right in the beginning of the session, we're going to take some time and actively focus on resourcing. So, are there some positive memories we can reflect on? What are the things that do help you feel soothed? And can we just think about them? Puppies, rainbows, unicorns, whatever it is. And they're orienting that they do in somatic experiencing. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But simply taking a moment to be in the present moment, looking around the room, noticing everything in more detail than you usually would, which brings you in the present, which by default brings you out of the past. And by default, that's going to be more regulating as long as we're in a literal safe environment in that present moment. So these are some examples of things you can do to front load the resourcing. Then you have more in somatic experience, and they call it pendulation. So, and this is such an important point. I'm glad we thought to go over all this, because it gets to one of my just things we can clean up in our field of counseling. So, in somatic experiencing, the way I learned it, you pretty sure would do kind of front end resourcing, different things. I think most therapists agree with that and would do that. And as you start to get into the work, I'm going to tell you the best version of how to use pendulation, in my opinion. As people are going in and they start to notice, different experiences, let's just call it fear. They're noticing some fear and they're able to stay with it. But then spontaneously, and as they're processing the memory or being with the fear, they say something that's along the lines of resourcing. They might, they might notice, their fear, but then they have the thought, thank goodness my limbs didn't get dismembered in any way. And then they keep going into the fear. In SE, they call it pouncing on the resource. When they say notice, when they say, thank goodness my limbs were still attached, just organically it shows up, you have them pause there and say, oh, can you just say that again? And just stay with that awareness. My limbs were still okay. And I'll give you an example, another example. I was in a car accident where I completely totaled my car. I tried to take on an RTD bus and it did not work out in my favor. Nobody was hurt, thank goodness. And I was working with an SE therapist at the time. And she actually asked me, so this would be more of kind of front loading. Did she? I'm going to pretend like she didn't, because I want to give you the example of the organic version. But I'm talking about the car accident, and then as I'm talking about it, I eventually said, yeah. Then I realized I was okay, and then I got out of the car, and I realized I need to get the car out of the road. And she was like, okay, 1 second, could you just go back to the time where I can get emotional just thinking about it, just when you realized you were okay? And I did that, and I stayed there for just a little bit longer, and like it just quite a bit shifted. I'll just leave it at that. Oh, sorry, I got plugged in my computer. So that's an example of pouncing on the resource as they come up organically. Where I think some therapists might go wrong is when the client is processing something intense, and the therapist just assumes it's too much and then pulls the client out of their experience, say to do the resourcing around the room, to do the orienting around the room. And you're taking the person out of the experience. There's a couple things about that. Like I've already covered, you might be sending them the signal, and it might be in your nervous system that this is too much. It's the last thing you ever want to do. The other thing is you're interrupting their process. And so nobody likes that. Nobody likes to be interrupted in general. Neurologically, it does not feel good. So that's exhibit B. And then the other piece is that if they can hang in there with it, and that's the first thing you should ask. If you have a sense it's a bit overwhelming, I would instead ask, is this more than you can handle, or can you hang in there with it? And boom, we're doing IFS and contracting now, like we've covered. So you can see how those kinds of questions, if you can go there instead, and the person says yes, if at all possible, don't take them out of their experience. Why? The main reason is they'll be able to go deeper. I did some SE training, but I also had the absolute privilege to do another training called containment and autonomic regulation. And that training was a spin-off of SE. So I learned a lot of the neurobiology there, but then they had a somewhat different approach. Unfortunately, that training is no longer available as far as I know. You could look into it. Love and Trauma Institute was the organization. I don't think they're around anymore. Cherie, could you fact check that? Great. But what they taught us was a technique called containment. And in containment, what they're talking about is containing containing voluntary movement so that think as if you were meditating. So you're sitting down to meditate, and you're not gonna like dance around while you're meditating. I get it. Unless you're doing authentic movement, you go. And that's different kind of mindfulness practice. But if you're just sitting down to do, say, sitting meditation, you're gonna by default contain any voluntary movement. What these people found is that if clients are open and willing to consciously doing that, when they're working on accessing either a resource, so you could do kind of front end resourcing, which is what they encourage you do in containment autonomic regulation, that you do front end resourcing and develop relational skills. I'm going to get to that. It's very important. And that you make sure certain things are online before you get to any containment while doing trauma work. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the front loading that they do. But in terms of the trauma work, and this is what SC has made so much more available, and I think it's so powerful and helpful, is that people can get to a point where they are allowing their autonomic nervous system to take over so fully that they start to experience involuntary physical responses. It could be what's gotten most famous, I think, is the shaking and the tremoring, but there's also a type of, they call it defense completion, where people start to feel their muscles contracting in ways that allow their body to complete a type of movement they maybe wanted to do when the trauma was happening. So I'll share kind of the most common example. I have a cringy example, but I'm going to spare you a personal cringy example. But the common example is when you have someone. I maybe touched on this when I talked a little bit on polyvagal wave. But anyways, it fits here, so we're gonna review it. If I'm working with someone who got hit in a car accident, and let's say the impact was here, if we're doing the containment work with it, we set it up, let's say we did front end resourcing, and we're ready to focus on the memory, they would have the person remember, like even before the accident happened, say in the morning when they woke up that day, what were you noticing? And they would track what they're feeling, they would talk about their day, and they would gradually get them closer and closer to the memory of when the impact happened. And sometimes this would be like the slowest, kind of gentlest, safest, quote unquote, way of getting to this. Sometimes before people even get to the actual impact, they start to notice some activation. And so what you might do, if the activation is significant enough, you would simply have them pause the memory. Okay, let's just pause there with the memory, and can you just stay with what's going on in your body? And even, leading up to the accident, they might start noticing their muscles contracting slowly. And this is involuntary. They're not controlling this at all. it is, I think, somewhat rarely paired with like uncomfortable feelings. In my experience, it's really more somatic than it is anything, but it absolutely can be paired with nausea, discomfort. Um, and what you notice is there the other piece is that if they wanted to, they could take over conscious control, come out of containment, containing the voluntary movement, and move and come out of it and interrupt the defense completion that's wanting to happen. But if they're able to stay with it, and if they're, it's going, and they might end up in just the funkiest postures. I've learned that the body kind of knows, has like a wisdom around um, where they're sitting, what they're sitting on, and people don't just flop out of chairs. They're able to kind of stay where they're at with what they need. And then if they stay with it long enough, eventually it completes. They feel like, kind of a sense of relaxation. And ended up doing like 30 sessions of this on my own. And I got to a point where I would meditate and just naturally go into autonomic defense completions. And I would tell my partner at the time, Rebecca, I'd say, I'm gonna just go. They'd be like this. Like, I'm going into the bedroom. I just get on the bed, and then things would just twist, and yeah, I did have some uncomfortable feelings. So maybe that's more common than I alluded to at the first initially. But the thing about this kind of somatic trauma work, I apologize, I've been dealing with the cough. With this kind of somatic trauma work is that, and this is the only time I've ever experienced anything like this. I've done a bunch of different psychotherapy models. I'm not saying it's not possible with the others, but with this, I feel consistently after the fact more energized, more alert. The senses are more vibrant, like semi altered state trippy in a very, very pleasant, lovely way. Pretty much every single time I was able to like see it all the way through. I believe, in my experience, that doing that kind of somatic deep processing is one of the absolute fastest way to release the stress that's in the physical body. Now, one of the things they alluded to from the SC connection is that SC folks, they thought, and I'm sure they got into talks with people, would absolutely be horrified that somebody would be allowed to just stay in this and keep going. Maybe things have changed. Feel free to comment if you know. But that they at some point would find a way to take them out of it and then pendulate back and forth. Which I'm sure has benefits in its own way. But here's the big but. I have heard multiple reports of folks who, because however it was done, left left after doing a lot of somatic experiencing with whatever practitioner, eventually feeling terrified to even go inside because the message they got was, okay, we need to bring you out of it. Okay, we need to bring you out of it. Don't do that. Like, just don't, whatever you're doing, that's absolutely not where we want people to land. We want them to feel completely at home in their body. So let me see. What else do I want to say about the containment? Oh, I'll add some links. Cherie, please help me remember. There are some lovely videos that the Love and Trauma Institute put online.
Yeah. Love and Trauma
on YouTube. YouTube. Saj Rivlin, I think is his last name. He's actually a cohort member of mine from when I was in grad school at Naropa. Brilliant psychotherapist, was one of the main people at that organization. And I'm pretty sure it's his YouTube channel. I'll find the links. I'm almost positive they're still up because I've shared them with clients recently. They have videos there of people doing this kind of processing. And I'm pretty sure seeing it all the way through. And then also, he has an amazing video. I'll add it in the description. I think it's called The Trauma Wave. It is an absolutely brilliant explanation of how the body travels through different defense responses when they experience increased threat. I've taken that table and I've enhanced it to add in polyvagal theory. It's a whole nother course I want to get to at some point. But you can absolutely start with his video. It is brilliant. I should have mentioned it earlier when I mentioned the trauma wave. It's a great, great resource to start with. Yeah. All right. So I think that's plenty. That's plenty in terms of containment. Now, if you're going to do full on car, classic car, the way I learned it, they wouldn't touch any of that until they knew that people had enough. They didn't talk about polyvagal, but ironically, this is what, or maybe they did. They called it relational skills. That's ventral vagal. Just quick summary, you got ventral vagal, that's the human responses, the most uh, the newest part of our threat response system. When and if we need to respond to threat, we will first try to talk it out. If that doesn't work, we will then go to fight flight. And if that isn't helping, or the threat continues to increase, and or we get overwhelmed, just physiologically overwhelmed, we'll then go into dorsal vagal, where our system starts to shut down. And at the most extreme state of dorsal vagal, your body is essentially preparing to die. There's so much more I can say about that. We'll get to that another day. But so brilliantly, without connecting it to polyvagal, Carr covers it in a sense where they say there's like 7 or 8 different relational skills that in a perfect world they would have clients practice. I don't even remember what any of the other ones are, except for saying yes or saying no. Like, think about it. In relationship, we've no. A reptile doesn't know how to do yes and to receive. Those are the only 2 I ever really work with. And I very rarely have the yes one. It's all about you, or just bringing back the capacity to say no, set a boundary. So here's the deal. Here's how to set this up. No and set a boundary. The way it was described to me, which I 100% don't agree with, is that if they can say no, if they bring that back online, then if something too intense comes up, they'll be able to say no. ETF, that's everything speaking not to do. Don't come from that place. Blech. What I love about it, is that obviously it's empowering. A lot of people, with a lot of trauma, your boundaries just get shattered. So to be able to reclaim that is a really, really, really big deal. And just creates more ventral vagal activation. Self is. As part of my presentation on polyvagal, I map out like where is self in this ventral vagal, where are firefighters, fight flight, where are managers. My understanding and experience would be more dorsal vagal, where mentally we end up more kind of checked out and we're able to just numbly observe things and be somewhat dissociated from what's getting exiled. And maybe exiles can be in different places, obviously, but feel like you need to at any point. But I want you, after I ask this question, to simply notice what gets activated in your body. And so then the therapist will ask some ridiculous request that the person should have no problem saying no to. So something silly I tend to ask, because I'm into politics to a degree these days. It used to be more. But I'll say, would you get on a unicycle and ride it to Washington, D.C. and get me blank senator's autograph? And usually most people can very easily say no. And the instructions are only say the word no. Don't explain. Don't say, I'm so sorry. None of that. It's the word no. And then notice what happens. What is interesting with some people, even something that ridiculous, stuff will start to activate. What do I mean by stuff? Shame, guilt, anxiety, tension. If that happens, choose your own adventure, more art than science. You can, if you think they can hang in there with it, just have them stay with it, because even, especially the more subtle expressions of autonomic activation, it can just simply then settle, and not get too intense. But what you could do instead, and then that's empowering. The thing is, this is a form of exposure therapy. Let's say there's a little bit of activation, they're able to sit with it, it settles, then simply ask the question again. And almost always, the second time it's this simple, it feels easier, it feels more available. And eventually, they'll get to a point where they experience what they call a resourced no. I'm saying no, and I'm totally good with it. I don't feel shame, don't feel guilt. I feel calm, confident, all the C's. I feel self led, simply saying no. The other option, instead of just working through some of the somatic stuff that comes up, because in this model, you're more aware and kind of sensitive to, with some people, there's a lot that could come up intensely right there and then. And if you're doing classic car, that's not what you want. So that said, if this is hard for them to do that, you got to think up of an even more extreme question that's even more ridiculous. It might even make them laugh. So you do that, you get the resource now, so that they can have an experience and a sense of what they're trying to move towards and create more of in their nervous system. Then the second phase is, and even over Zoom, I practice this and people are just pretending. But the question is, could you hand me a Kleenex? How socially awkward to say no to something you can do. That's the whole point. So they say just the word no, and most people have some response to that. The same thing, just stay in containment. Usually it's relatively mild with most people, but they notice whatever shame, awkwardness, and then just rinse and repeat. Okay, can you hand me a Kleenex now? No. Eventually they'll get there. And then if you're wanting to stay with this, and this is where, you're doing resourcing techniques essentially, but obviously it can overlap into trauma stuff. You can, the third tier is practicing with any authority figure. And according to the CAR folks, Eric Walterstorff was the inventor of all this. And he's got some fantastic YouTube videos. There's some interviews he's given and some lectures of his are there. He's absolutely brilliant. And he's the one who created the trauma wave map. I should have named that. And so he does a lot of work with transference. This is interesting. So I'm just going to leave it in here. There's a whole version of their approach called, I think it's called relational CAR, RCAR, where the client would go into containment, look at you as the therapist, and just imagine that you're one of four roles or three roles. I think they maybe talked about three roles, but there's four roles in the Cartman drama triangle. If you think it through a little bit more, there's offender, victim, rescuer, and then the fourth would be just a witness, like a bystander. And what he believed is that people hold energy and transference and baggage essentially around any of those roles. And so this is a total sidebar, but it can be a very powerful thing to work through. Is just to pretend like your therapist is, let's say, a rescuer, and then just while in containment, just free associate whatever comes to mind about that. And it's fascinating. It's like psychoanalysis on steroids. You just work through the transference and it can shift to a whole lot of different places. And then you can do each of the roles and just process. So that's a more advanced technique in that model. And I'm going to tell you at the end of this, probably what we're going to get to today, these resourcing modalities or approaches and I think that's fair. And I hope this meets your need for self-pres. Before we get into working with exiles, I'll tell you why I'm going through all of this, all the different nuances of CAR. But let me think. Back to the no, saying no. So let's just say, yeah, the third tier. So the third tier is any authority figure, and according to Walterstorff and company, for most people, the pinnacle is saying no to your mother. If it's not one thing, it's your mother, and they agree in this regard. So play around with that. Actually, I'll do the pitch now. So why am I going into all these nuances? Listen, therapists. And if you are a coach doing coaching work in whatever way, it is our responsibility to do our own work, period, end of discussion. These approaches can be pretty intense for folks. So I don't use the car containment stuff with everyone. But us as therapists, if we haven't gotten to a point where we can do this kind of work, it's time for us to do our work. And we should get to a point, I think, where we can do this work and do, I think ideally these specific approaches I'm covering would be taught in counseling grad schools so that cohort members can work and practice with each other or find a therapist and just work it through more quickly. It's one of the fastest, deepest way to just reset the nervous system. Not for everyone, but if you're going to be a therapist, there should be a high correlation in terms of your ability to do this kind of work. And if not, just do your work to get there. I believe pretty much everyone is capable eventually with the right kind of support. All right, that's my picture on that. All right, let's talk about yes a little bit. So no is the one channel, and you got the 3 different tiers to eventually get to. And eventually they're able to say no to mom, say no to the boss, say no. I wouldn't, in this phase, until you're actually like doing trauma work, I wouldn't get into saying no to an offender. But you can see now we haven't gotten to it yet. Later in the IFS questions, we're going to talk about redos and do-overs, but we're not there yet. But this is akin to that. This overlaps with that. And so then yes, what is a yes? When I took the training, I actually did it with Saj, and he simply used the prompt, could I close the door behind you? And holy moly, I went into just such an immediate, powerful in the moment, and for years I thought it was because I have trouble receiving, which you could make that argument or could have made that argument. Who would have trouble receiving from Cherie? But yeah, she's shaking her head now. So all right, we worked through that. But I think more what it was in hindsight, after I've thought about this a bit, it was just a shame response to being told I should have closed the door and I didn't. Either way, I got to work through something. It was powerful. That said, I would pick something else that's actually a good example of pick something that wouldn't be misconstrued at that, like just a genuine offer. Ironically, you can just offer, could I get you a Kleenex? And for them to say yes. For a lot of folks, we have stuff associated with that. And I meant to mention this earlier, like, what is it that's coming up? What is exactly this shame, this guilt, this whatever? These are the responses our bodies had at some point when we tried to say no, or we wanted to say yes or did say yes, and then we got shamed. There's an amazing chapter, I'll put the link in the description below, that I use in my Gestalt class about shame. The nugget in the piece is that the powerful reframe around shame is that if you felt shame as a child, the true story there isn't that there was something wrong with you, but that the environment had deficits. So essentially, we're exploring times where you had every right to say no, to say yes, and the environment simply had a deficit and couldn't handle it. And now we're setting the stage to reclaim all of that, to just reclaim the ability, the ventral vagal ability to say no, to say yes. Okay, that one piece, I just saved you a lot of money. That was like the core of the card training, which I don't think is available anymore. I weave that technique in here and there, even with doing IFS, just in subtle ways, just having people process whatever, but supporting them and going into containment. So the autonomic nervous system, and sometimes it's as simple as, give you a quick example. I was working with a teenager, had him do this, and it was really powerful for him, because he tended to be kind of a talky, jittery guy. And so it forced him to not be jittery. And then he experienced this like shudder go through his body and then release. And it was, trippy for him and powerful and helpful and deeper and quicker. It's just something to play around with. Okay. So I went into all that essentially to give you an example of front load resourcing. Carr would say, get the yes, get the no online before you do any trauma work. Just and then I'm going to argue just to get a more ventral vagal. All right, so that's front loading, resourcing. We talked about pendulation, doing things in the middle. Uh, Not a fan. I'll just say it. Unless it's spontaneous. If we're pouncing on a resource that spontaneously arises, yes, and it doesn't disrupt the process. All right, and here's the last and third genre. I'm pretty sure I have more, but I think I may have given you the whole lecture series today. But can you guess what the third one is? IFS. Yes. We don't have to mess my experience, we don't have to mess with really any of that as long as we are first doing these steps and the 6 Fs. That is self is resourcing. So if you're unblending enough to get folks in self, you're good. You're golden. And you just stay with, well, how are you feeling towards it? Oh, it's still okay. Then we're just going to stay with that and honor it and give that some self energy. And you're staying in self. Earlier, when I was going through my diatribe, like that's what I'm advocating from therapists. Like, can you stay in self so that from an IFS lens, you continue to do direct access? Yeah, if you can't do that and do that in the face of difficult emotions, then yeah, don't mess with this. Don't look at this stuff yet. Fine. Keep doing your work. Keep doing some trainings on how to work with emotions or SE. Um, yeah, I'll just say one important nuance about SE, maybe this has changed, I hope it has, is that like with the CBT folks, and I'm going to say old school CBT folks, they're like, emotions. I am not wasting my time with that. All we got to do is change your thinking. Or behaviorism, emotions, no, let's just get them acting differently. That's ridiculous because what if the person can't act differently? Ross Green, I think I mentioned it. Children do well if they want to versus children do well if they can. If they can't do it, you're just shaming them. But so it's interesting because I guess any of these schools of therapy can get a little dogmatic. With somatic experiencing, some of my sense of it at times is that their main focus is on sensations, and that's what we stay focused on. And feelings, you can notice how feelings in each of these examples is being kind of discarded or not. I don't know, just not honored. I think in the ways they should, and just potentially an over focus on sensations, and then. Uh, like I've said, I think feelings are very, very, very important. Why would a CBT person think feelings are not that important? Because if you change your thoughts, it certainly affects your feelings, but they would maybe argue that it causes feelings. So just, go to the source of changing the thoughts. I don't think feelings are caused all the time by thoughts. Maybe some feelings can be caused by a thought, but there's always an inherent nonstop, I would argue, transpersonal feeling that's already always there, and that's tied to any expression of the feeling. And so that is for me primary. And then the physical body is secondary, like this transpersonal energy is coming through the physical body. So yeah, sensations fine, great. We want to work with all that and honor and respect it. And just look at psychosomatic illnesses. Why do people end up with psychosomatic illnesses traditionally as we think about it? They didn't feel their feelings. And so eventually they've got a headache. Headaches in Gestalt are a little bit famous for being anger. You push down your anger, and some, more holistic type folks will think that correlates with getting headaches. And then I don't spend much time on this stuff anymore, but you can take that to the extreme with the Louise Hay book, You Can Heal Your Life. And there's another one that's actually better called Permanent Healing. I'm not remembering the author. I'll put a link below, where they tie all sorts of pretty complex diseases and situations, physical diseases and ailments to psychospiritual even stuff. I think you have to be really careful about that kind of thing because it can be very, very victim blaming in a sense. And if it resonates for you and you think your knee issues are because you have ego issues and you work out your ego, no one everyone benefits from working on inflated egos. So it's fine. I don't think it does any harm necessarily. But I've seen many times people come in with all sorts of like physical sensations. We work with it, we tune in, but underneath it is emotions that needed to be felt, that needed to be validated. Um, okay, so what I'm a fan of is making sure people are in self, making sure I'm in self, contracting when we need to. Maybe first just checking out, is this too much for them? And if it is, then we can move into the contracting piece and just really pause there until we need to. And the last thing I'm going to say about all this is at the end of the day, like I alluded to earlier, when we create these safe spaces, stuff's going to come up. It doesn't mean you re-traumatized anything. You maybe in this context that I'm describing, there's nothing you can do. Your job is to help midwife it through. See it as natural. Be present with them. Have compassion for it. Have curiosity around it. And whatever way you need to, get enough experience with this stuff so that you know from experience that a panic attack is going to eventually settle if the person just has the right kind of support. We even had clients, and you don't ever want this, but sometimes there's no helping it, but like full on dissociate in the session. You don't ever want that. And if it's happening in your session, guess what? It's happening in their lives. And so it is an opportunity to be held with so much love and care and non-judgment. And then as you work with it, eventually that all gets better. The dissociative stuff gets better, even that. I'm glad I mentioned dissociation. All right, so I have a little piece around that. Here's the thing. A lot of the pendulation stuff and like pulling them out of their experience is the stuff that I hear. A lot of it is around dissociation. People, for some reason, start to freak out if clients start to get dissociated. Let me give you a really important tip. Almost every single time, as people are working with X, Y, or Z, if they start to feel somewhat dissociated, I'm actually tell you two things, but this is the main one that I do. Ask them to ask the part if that dissociative experience was some of what the part felt. Because guess what? Now we're getting into it. It's witnessing. There's witnessing that's happening. It's somatic witnessing. And messing it all up. As soon as the client recognizes that, it's like, oh yeah, or the part saying, yeah, when we dissociated, I dissociated, they immediately unblend. And then they can be aware of the part that was dissociating. And oftentimes it just brings them right out of it. So here's the tip. The tip is you want to be thinking implicit memory. Pretty much any of this stuff that comes up, it's implicit memory. Explicit memory, I can remember the actual event, I know when it happened. Implicit memory, the feelings and sensations. And a lot of trauma work is about making the implicit explicit, and this is the process in which we do it. So the moment that a client can actually connect whatever the somatic experience is to that part, boom, they're aware and they're in self and they're witnessing. In process work, they talk about it being, this is kind of like, every model's got their idea of what's the ideal. So in IFS, we want to get people more in self. In process work, he talks about the meta communicator. So an element of consciousness that can see it all, that can be aware of all the channels. That's essentially what you're able to help people identify. I said there'd be another one. The other one is that more specifically, it might be a different part that sends the client into dissociation. And so you can ask that sometimes too, is there a part in there that is causing this dissociation, and can we talk to that part directly? And then there's work you can do there. Really, the moral of this story is don't be afraid of any of it. Just like I talked about a while ago, where it got kind of weird, transpersonal, we're talking about entities and consciousness. Don't be afraid of any of this. Of course, be kind, be patient, pause, allow, but trust trust the human experience. People are designed and engineered really, really, really well. And if we know that, and if we can trust that, that's kind of half the battle. So I feel like today was just a big diatribe. Were there any questions?
No, just
No.
Bridget made a comment.
Yeah. Bridget, thank you for sharing this experience, Cherie. I'm
This was
curious.
earlier on.
Oh, hi, Bridget. I know Bridget. Bridget, it's so good to see you. I love that you're here today. All right, so let me think. Is there any? I think those are the main three resourcing things. There might be some more types of resourcing. Nah, of course. All right, so let me. Here's the thing, and we already covered this. My favorite thing to do, aside from really IFS, but even beyond IFS, is just to pause. That's why I love the pause, allow, appreciate meditation. And hopefully by the time you're seeing this, I've already posted a video where I've re-recorded it. I have a version, but it's got noise in the background. So I'm going to get to that at some point. And so you'll have that meditation that'll give you more of a sense of what I'm talking about. But here's the thing. As long as you can maintain contact, and of course, play around with, can they hang in there, get them self-led, whatever comes up for people, they can handle it. And so just slow it down. Just slow it down. I give one more shout out to ACT. I don't remember his name, but he wrote the Kochi book on ACT that got really popular. I'll remember it. I'll put the link below. Some ACT resources. But he had this thing, a clinical director I once worked for told me about this. She went to an ACT conference and she said one of the most brilliant things he said as he's sharing about ACT is that we need to hurry up and slow down. And it changed her life. It changed my life. And I appreciate supporting you all in changing other people's lives. Like and subscribe. Gosh darn it. Please, for the love of Moses, like and subscribe. Again, if we get to 1,000 people, what are we at? How are we at now?
281.
281. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when we were just at 220 for 7 years. And here we are, just growing in leaps and bounds. But if we can get to 1,000, then I can do cooler things with links. I can put links in that are off-site. I'm pretty sure that's the thing. There was something cool I could do. Anyways, all right. Appreciate everyone's attention. Bridget, thanks for showing up. It's good to see you. And look forward to seeing you all next week. Take good care.